It was a damp, foggy December evening at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The chill of winter had seeped into the ancient stone walls. Torches flickered and crackled in their brackets, casting dancing orange glows along the corridors. Students grumbled about the biting cold, their breath clouding in the air. Harry Potter, however, hardly felt the winter's sting. His mind was trapped in an internal winter of its own, swirling with questions he couldn't answer. For weeks now, Dumbledore had been guiding Harry to collect crucial information from a single source, Horace Slughorn. The wily potions master, pleasant, vain, and sentimental about his most illustrious pupils, was rumored to hold a memory about Lord Voldemort's past. That memory, Dumbledore insisted, could prove vital to unraveling the key to defeating the Dark Lord. But the older wizard's shame or fear had caused him to alter and conceal it. Harry tried and tried, playing to Slughorn's vanity, but to no avail. Each effort ended in a polite dismissal, a phony smile, or a friendly brush-off. On this particular evening, Harry had just left Slughorn's office for the third time that week. Again, he'd failed to persuade the potions master to hand over the full, unaltered memory of the conversation Slughorn had once had with a young Tom Riddle decades ago. Whether it was shame or a misguided sense of self-preservation, Slughorn simply refused. His memory remained locked away, carefully edited to erase any damning mention of Horcruxes. Exhausted and dispirited, Harry wandered through the corridors until he reached the familiar stone gargoyle that protected the headmaster's staircase. The gargoyle leapt aside in recognition of Harry's presence. Dumbledore had given him free passage these days. Harry ascended the revolving staircase, each footstep heavier than the last. He found Dumbledore seated behind his desk, half-moon spectacles perched on his crooked nose, peering intently at an ancient tome. Dumbledore looked up, expression immediately reflecting concern. "I gather you didn't succeed this time either," he said softly. Even his voice, normally so resolute, carried an edge of despondence. Harry nodded, shoulders slumping. "I tried everything we discussed," he said. Syrup of hellebore in his tea, compliments on his newest velvet waistcoat, hints about collecting me. Nothing works. Dumbledore removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the desk. He pressed his fingers together. "I see," he said quietly, the lines on his face deepening. "We shall have to find another way, or at least proceed as best we can without it." His voice wavered with uncharacteristic uncertainty. Harry realized, with a chill, that Dumbledore himself was at a loss. That single unaltered memory was critical to understanding Voldemort's methods, how he had split his soul into multiple Horcruxes, and precisely how many of them existed. Without that knowledge, they were groping blindly in the dark. Even so, Harry could never have predicted just how dark things were about to become. Spring semester brought longer days, but the gloom never quite lifted from Hogwarts. Dumbledore's hand, withered and blackened from the cursed ring he had destroyed, served as a daily reminder that they were already behind Voldemort. Each passing day felt like another lost chance. Dumbledore continued giving Harry lessons. Glimpses into Voldemort's past via the pensieve, Snape's repeated warnings about wandering minds and rash vulnerabilities echoed around him. But Harry believed wholeheartedly in Dumbledore's guidance. They pressed on with half-known rumors. That Riddle might have stolen relics from the Founders, that there might be multiple Horcruxes out there, stashed in the darkest corners of the wizarding world. But without a precise count or the details that Slughorn's memory contained, finding and destroying them was like hunting for invisible beasts in the Forbidden Forest at midnight. No matter how many times Dumbledore and Harry revisited old testimonies or scoured genealogies of artifacts, they kept running into a dead end. Dumbledore held on to hope. Maybe Slughorn would relent one day, or Harry would find an approach that finally broke through the old man's shell of guilt. But the days turned into weeks, and Slughorn maintained his position. With each refusal, an invisible chain seemed to coil around Hogwarts, tight and suffocating. Students whispered about shadows that scurried along corridors at night. A sense of dread thickened the atmosphere. It was not a matter of if Voldemort would strike, but when, and they remained unprepared. That summer, Near the end of term, Dumbledore located a secret cave on a remote rocky coastline. He brought Harry along, suspecting they might find one of the Horcruxes there. Within that cavern, an intricate set of traps indeed guarded a locket rumored to be Slytherin's. Despite the swirling, watery inferi and the draining potion that nearly robbed Dumbledore of his mind, they escaped with the locket in hand. A small triumph, to be sure, but upon returning to Hogwarts, they discovered the locket was a fake, bearing a cryptic note from someone known only as R.A.B. "There are more," Dumbledore whispered to Harry later, in the deserted astronomy tower. His voice was ragged from physical and mental strain. "But how many precisely we do not know. For that, we need Slughorn's memory. We mustn't lose hope." But Slughorn had vanished for the summer. He had left the castle earlier than usual, refusing all owls. No one, not even the meddlesome ghost Peeves, knew where he'd gone. So the pair pressed on with guesswork. Gradually, Dumbledore grew weaker, his cursed hand draining more of his life force every day. He hung on to one last hopeful lead. He would track down rumors of another Horcrux hidden in the heart of London. Meanwhile, Harry was instructed to return to the Dursleys and remain out of sight until further notice. His mind whirled. He had glimpsed enough in the pensieve to know the stakes, but he still had no firm answer. Voldemort's anchor to immortality remained shrouded in half-truths and speculation. Summer at Privet Drive was worse than ever. The sky seemed perpetually gray. Every morning, Harry scanned the Daily Prophet, reading about new Death Eater attacks and sightings of the Dark Mark around Britain. With Voldemort's ascent, fear spread like wildfire. Old families fled the country, and the Ministry sputtered about with incompetent attempts at damage control. Through coded messages from the Order of the Phoenix, Harry learned that Dumbledore's condition was deteriorating, and the old wizard had pinned his last hopes on unraveling at least one more Horcrux. But the quest was doomed to frustration. Dumbledore fell ill and took to his bed at Hogwarts, refusing to let a wide-eyed Madame Pomfrey anywhere near the blackened, cursed flesh creeping up his arm. The only living wizard who might have been able to help was Severus Snape, but Snape's divided loyalties complicated everything. The half-curt, often cryptic potions he administered slowed the curse's progress, but did not cure it. Every so often, an exhausted Dumbledore would awaken, eyes drifting with half-lidded determination. He'd mutter, "Slughorn memory, must know the number." But Slughorn remained hidden, and time was slipping through their fingers like shifting sands. When Harry arrived back at Hogwarts for his 7th year, the Board of Governors had insisted the school remain open. He discovered a castle under siege, if not physically, then psychologically. Rumors abounded that Death Eaters were planning an infiltration. Aurors patrolled the corridors. McGonagall, now the acting headmistress in all but name, looked worn. Dumbledore was convalescing in his tower, rarely seen in public. Snape's expression was even more inscrutable, and with each passing day, he hovered near the headmaster's chambers, leaving only to teach his classes. Harry, for his part, felt the weight of destiny heavier than ever. He wandered the castle at night with his invisibility cloak, occasionally chancing upon silent corridors that suddenly echoed with footsteps of a patrolling Auror. More than once, he'd slip into a hidden alcove, breath caught in his throat. Security had never been so tight. Meanwhile, the quest to find Horcruxes felt abandoned. Without the vital piece of knowledge, Slughorn's true memory, they had no idea whether 4, 5, or even more Horcruxes lay scattered around the world. In stolen moments, Harry pored over notes Dumbledore had given him, but they led nowhere. He was chasing illusions. He found himself cursing Slughorn's cowardice. The old man was likely in some hidden corner of the wizarding world, ignoring the catastrophe building around him. And so, the weight on Harry's shoulders grew almost unbearable. He needed answers, but the one man who might have them was far beyond his reach. By October, Hogwarts was blanketed by swirling, bitter winds and frequent storms. On a particularly dark morning, Harry trudged out to the edge of the Black Lake, hoping that the crisp air would clear his head. He found Luna Lovegood skipping stones across the murky water, humming some tune. Standing next to her, he felt an odd sense of calm. Her wide, dreamy eyes gazed at him. "You look troubled, Harry," she said simply. "I am. I need Slughorn. Need that memory." Luna nodded, her gaze drifting over to the forbidden forest in the distance. "I wonder if he's too ashamed. He would, after all, feel responsible for telling Tom Riddle things no one should know." Harry stared at her in disbelief. Luna's insight sometimes came from nowhere. She gave a small smile, adding, "Maybe he thinks giving you the memory won't erase his own guilt." Harry exhaled, the tension in his chest twisting painfully. "Maybe, but without that memory, we're doomed. We can't even begin to guess at how to destroy all the Horcruxes." Luna shrugged, skipping another stone. "You'll find a way. Maybe we all will." But Harry couldn't share her optimism. As if in answer to his unspoken fears, lightning split the sky above the lake. A thunderclap followed, resonating in the pit of his stomach. Somewhere in the distance, the Grindylows churned the shallow waters. A storm was coming, both literally and metaphorically. Halloween that year was unlike any other. Instead of the usual pumpkins and floating decorations, the Great Hall was lined with protective charms, oars posted at each entrance. The entire castle was on high alert, bracing for an attack that felt inevitable. The mood was tense, and no one wanted to celebrate. Then, in the dead of the night, it happened. Under the cover of a raging thunderstorm, a handful of hooded figures, Death Eaters, broke through the protective wards. Whether there was a traitor or simply a gap in the centuries-old enchantments, no one knew. They flooded into the castle, curses flying through corridors as frightened students cowered behind statues or locked themselves in classrooms. By the time the alarm spread, everything was chaos. McGonagall, Flitwick, and other teachers rallied the Aurors and prefects, leading a defense. The thick smell of ozone filled the corridors, and brilliant flashes of green, red, and blue curses illuminated the night. Portraits screamed and fled from their frames. Harry found himself caught up in the melee. Taking cover behind a gargoyle, he narrowly avoided a blast from a masked Death Eater. He retaliated with a stunning spell, his heart pounding. His mind reeled. His wand felt slick with sweat. He glimpsed a swirl of black robes vanish around a corner. Shouts echoed from different parts of the castle. "They're heading to the hospital wing. Cut them off near the charms corridor. Protect the headmaster's tower." At that last cry, Harry's blood ran cold. If the Death Eaters were heading for Dumbledore's tower, the headmaster was in peril. Without a second thought, Harry sprinted through the corridor, adrenaline surging with each footstep. Paintings on the walls barked warnings or shouted in panic. Suits of armor clashed in the distance. He reached the spiral staircase just in time to see 3 Death Eaters blasting apart the stone gargoyle. With a deafening crack, the Guardian statue crumbled, and the robed figures surged upward. Harry shouted, "Stupefy!" But they evaded, returning fire with arcs of green light that singed the walls. Harry Dove rolled behind a fallen piece of rubble and felt a rush of hot wind singe his hair. It was madness, a swirl of curses and screaming stone. Ultimately, the main door to Dumbledore's quarters exploded off its hinges. Inside, Dumbledore himself, frail, trembling, but unwavering, stood behind his desk. His blackened hand clutched his wand. The sudden intrusion forced him to rally his last shreds of strength. With a brilliant flash of silver light, he toppled 2 of the Death Eaters, leaving only one. A tall figure with a sinister, mocking voice. Harry, crawling in behind them, recognized that voice as Bellatrix Lestrange's. She let out a mad cackle as she raised her wand at Dumbledore, who was reeling from the exertion. "You're weak, old man," she jeered. "The Dark Lord will reward me greatly for delivering your head." A second, more chilling voice stopped her short. Another hooded Death Eater stepped in from behind her, voice cold as ice. "No, Bella. He wants him alive, if possible." Harry recognized that voice too, though he wanted to deny it. Severus Snape. His face was masked, but the tone, the posture, everything about the man was unmistakable. Dumbledore's eyes flickered. "Severus, you must protect the school," he said weakly. Snape strode forward. In a single movement, he disarmed Dumbledore. The headmaster's wand flew across the room, clattering onto the floor near Harry's hiding spot. Harry froze, shock rendering him motionless. Bellatrix turned triumphantly. "Now, kill him, Severus." There was a brief silence, the tension electric. Snape's wand pointed at Dumbledore, who swayed on his feet. Then, just as Harry found the courage to leap out, wand raised, Snape whipped around and cast a spell that knocked Bellatrix back, slamming her against the wall. She collapsed, unconscious. Before Harry could react further, Snape turned and cast a swirl of dark, binding magic that pinned Harry to the floor, wand clattering from his grasp. He twisted, struggling, but Snape's hold was too strong. "Potter!" Snape hissed. "Stay still." Harry's heart thundered. He watched in bewilderment as Snape approached the limp form of Dumbledore. Bellatrix was stirring. In mere seconds, she'd rise and likely attempt murder again. Snape bent low, placed a small golden object into Dumbledore's palm, and whispered, "Headmaster, the next time, call me earlier." Bellatrix regained consciousness with a snarl. Hissing, "Traitor!" she hurled a curse at Snape, who deflected it easily. Then a flurry of spells lit the air in the cramped office. Snape engaged Bellatrix, forcibly dragging her back toward the door as an alarm from the corridor signaled the approach of reinforcements. She spat curses at him, shrieking vile threats. But Snape forcibly shoved her into the corridor, away from Dumbledore and Harry. Oars poured in, and the final standoff ended in chaos. The Death Eaters, outnumbered, retreated in a swirl of black smoke. In the aftermath, Snape was nowhere to be found. He had vanished into the stormy night. McGonagall, battered but fierce, rushed in to check on Dumbledore and Harry. The rest of the castle slowly reassembled itself, but that night changed everything. It was now clear. The war had spilled through the very doors of Hogwarts. In the following days, rumors tore the student body in half. Half believed Snape had saved them by driving off Bellatrix. The other half believed him a traitor who had only pretended to fight on Dumbledore's side for some twisted reason. Truth was, no one knew the full story except Dumbledore, and he was barely able to speak. The attack and his own cursed injury had pushed him to the brink. Harry waited each day outside the hospital wing, impatient for news. Finally, on a bleak November morning, Madame Pomfrey allowed him in. His heart lurched at the sight. Dumbledore appeared gaunt, the shadow of his blackened arm stretching across the bed like a dark omen. Yet his eyes flickered open when Harry approached, and a weary smile graced his lips. "Harry, I owe you an apology," he croaked. Harry swallowed, sinking into the chair beside the bed. "No, Professor, none of this." But Dumbledore raised his good hand, silencing him. "I led you to believe Slughorn's memory was our only route, but we must face the truth. We may never recover it. Horcruxes must be found some other way." Harry felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "We have no leads, sir." Dumbledore's eyes drifted closed, but he continued. "In my travels, I suspected a relic of Ravenclaw might hold a Horcrux, the diadem hidden, and there's the ring already destroyed, the diary you destroyed. The locket we recovered was false. We must consider the snake Nagini, possibly something of Hufflepuff's. All guesswork, my boy. But without Slughorn's memory, we don't know how many more. Could be 6, could be 7, could be more," Harry said, voice tight. Dumbledore gave a faint nod. "Precisely. We must rely on guesswork." The first real hint of Tom Riddle's intentions was in that conversation with Slughorn. He never gave us the truth. Dumbledore's voice cracked, his eyes glistening with regret and pain. At that moment, the towering truth Harry had been avoiding came crashing down. They might fail. Voldemort had the advantage. Without precise knowledge, they were half-blind in a labyrinth of horrors. A week later, just as the castle was starting to heal from the attack, An owl soared through the great hall during breakfast. It dropped a small, sealed envelope in front of Harry. The lettering on the envelope was shaky, but unmistakable. H.E.F. Slughorn. Harry's heart thundered in his chest. He tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a short note. Harry, forgive me. I cannot face my guilt in person, nor can I endanger you further by returning. But I must at least provide you with a clue. If Riddle did indeed turn to Horcruxes, he spoke of making more than one. He admired Slytherin's locket, Hufflepuff's cup, and, if he could manage, an object of Ravenclaw's or Gryffindor's. A total of 7 pieces, if I recall his ambition correctly. That is all I can bear to say. I am sorry. H. Slughorn. Harry's mouth ran dry. Slughorn had given him a piece of the puzzle. Still not the memory in its entirety, but the gist. Riddle wanted to split his soul 7 times. That meant 6 Horcruxes plus the final piece inside himself, or some arrangement of 7 total fragments. Anger and relief warred within Harry. If he had told them sooner, if he had simply given Dumbledore the memory, the headmaster might not be on his deathbed. But no matter. Harry sprang up, ignoring stares from classmates. He fled the Great Hall to deliver the note to McGonagall and the rest of the Order. This was the first sign that perhaps they could mount a real search. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The Order mobilized, scouring known Death Eater hideouts, ancient wizarding families' manors, and rumored Horcrux hotspots. Gringotts in London, the Gaunt Shack, old orphanage sites. Each expedition bristled with the tension of the unknown. Dumbledore, still bedridden, could only watch from afar, delegating tasks to the senior members of the Order. Harry found himself sent on missions, accompanied by members like Remus Lupin, Bill Weasley, and sometimes Tonks. Without the unaltered memory, they had patchwork intelligence, but at least Slughorn's letter provided a general total: 7 pieces of soul. Over time, they confirmed the destruction of the diary, the ring, and discovered that the real Slytherin's locket was hidden in Grimmauld Place by Sirius's late brother, Regulus, R.A.B. Hufflepuff's cup was rumored to be in the Lestrange vault in Gringotts, and the rest were only guesses: the diadem of Ravenclaw, Nagini, or some unknown artifact. It was a dizzying game of cat and mouse. The slightest misstep could mean doom. In the midst of it all, Dumbledore finally succumbed to his curse. One cold winter's morning, word spread that he had breathed his last. The world seemed to freeze at the news. Hogwarts stood still, uncertain of its future. McGonagall organized a memorial unlike any other, wands raised to the sky. The old headmaster's body was placed in a tomb on the school grounds. There was no time to grieve properly. The war rolled on. Though his heart was shattered, Harry resolved to continue. If anything, the new knowledge of the Horcruxes, albeit incomplete, fueled him with renewed purpose. Dumbledore would have wanted him to press on. Voldemort wasted no time exploiting the headmaster's demise. Death Eater attacks escalated. The Ministry fell under partial control of puppet officials loyal to the Dark Lord. Muggle-born witches and wizards were persecuted. Undaunted, Harry, Ron, and Hermione dropped out of Hogwarts, now under partial occupation, and set off on their Horcrux hunt. They eventually stole the cup from the Lestrange vault, destroyed it with the Sword of Gryffindor, located the real locket, and similarly destroyed it. The daily near-death experiences and the heartbreak of seeing the wizarding world in tatters made them question everything. But, bit by bit, they reduced Voldemort's soul. Only 2 pieces remained, as best they could guess. Nagini, always at her master's side, and one unknown object that they had not yet identified. Without Slughorn's true memory, they assumed it was Ravenclaw's diadem, but they had no proof. Clues pointed them back to Hogwarts, ironically enough. So, on a fateful evening, the trio returned to the castle. Under the guidance of a few loyal staff members and a handful of D.A., Dumbledore's army veterans like Neville Longbottom, they scoured the Room of Requirement. There, concealed among mountains of forgotten objects, they found it. Ravenclaw's diadem, shimmering with an unnatural, eerie light. As curses flashed outside, Death Eaters, alerted to their presence, converged on the castle once again. Harry felt his scar burn. Voldemort was near. The final confrontation loomed. With a flash of steel, Ron struck the diadem with Gryffindor's sword. It split, shrieking with a dark, unholy wail that rattled their bones. Black mist seeped out, forming a ghostly visage of Tom Riddle's face before dissipating into nothingness. One Horcrux down. But as if summoned by the diadem's destruction, Voldemort himself materialized in the hallway. His crimson eyes blazed with fury. Nagini slithered at his feet. Behind him, Death Eaters poured into the corridor. In that moment, it felt like the entire school was pulsing with fear. Harry and Voldemort locked gazes. This was it. The final piece lay within Nagini, and once she was gone, Voldemort would be mortal. But how to get to her? The corridor was a battlefield. Spells erupted in a chaotic rainbow of lethal color. Neville, Hermione, and Ron battled fiercely, but the Death Eaters pressed in. Voldemort unleashed dark curses that rent the air with thunderous booms. Somewhere in the madness, Horace Slughorn appeared. No one had seen him arrive, but he stood at the corridor's edge, face pale with terror, and guilt, and something that looked like resolve. He raised his wand, though it trembled. Harry, battered from dueling a wave of Death Eaters, caught sight of him. In a flash, he recalled all the frustration, the wasted time, the memory that might have saved countless lives, including Dumbledore's. But there was no time for anger. Only the present mattered now. Slughorn pointed his wand directly at Nagini. His voice quavered with the incantation, but it was strong enough. A bright, searing blast erupted from the tip, striking Nagini with pure force. The snake let out a hideous, hissing cry. Voldemort turned, mouth twisting in fury, and launched a killing curse at Slughorn. The old potion's master collapsed to the floor, silent forever. But Nagini was gravely wounded, coiling in on herself as black energy crackled around her. That dark shrieking returned, echoing off the stone walls. Harry felt a wave of dizziness as if the entire building was spinning. Then silence. Nagini lay dead, the final shred of Voldemort's splintered soul disintegrating into oblivion. Voldemort's eyes widened in horror. In that instant, Harry knew the Dark Lord stood truly mortal. Holding his wand with both hands, Harry mustered the final ounce of courage within him. The corridor seemed to fall away. All he could see was the serpentine face twisted in rage. He spoke a disarming charm, but the power behind it was more than just a typical Expelliarmus. It was a lifetime of sacrifice and love culminating in one unstoppable wave of magic. Voldemort tried to hurl the killing curse, but the wands connected in a fountain of sparks. A brief standoff, then Voldemort's wand flew from his skeletal hand, spinning in the air. The Dark Lord, undone by the destruction of his Horcruxes, fell back. At once, the curses in the corridor ceased. Without instructions from their master, the Death Eaters faltered. Some disapparated instantly, while others simply dropped their wands in disbelief. Voldemort himself reeled, collapsing to his knees, powerless. Harry, standing only a few paces away, watched the once fearsome wizard breathe his last. No final shriek or curse, only a quiet exhalation, followed by stillness. In the hush that followed, the battered defenders of Hogwarts gathered around. Slughorn's body lay near the broken form of Nagini. A wave of grief and relief and exhaustion washed over them all. Voldemort was gone. The final Horcrux was destroyed, but so many lives had been lost to get here. Dumbledore, hundreds of innocents, and Horace Slughorn himself, who, too late, had realized his role in Riddle's ascent. The wizarding world began the arduous journey of rebuilding. Hogwarts needed repairs. Families mourned their dead. Trials were held for Death Eaters who had been captured. Harry Potter, hailed yet again as the boy who lived, wanted nothing more than to slip away from the spotlight. But one lesson was painfully clear. If Slughorn had only shared that memory in time, so much of this devastation might have been prevented. Dumbledore might have lived longer. Others, too, might have been spared. Weeks after Voldemort's fall, Harry found himself in Dumbledore's old office, now McGonagall's. The new headmistress offered him a seat. Fawkes's perch stood empty, the phoenix long gone. A hush settled over the room. "You've done well, Mr. Potter," McGonagall said softly. Harry nodded, eyes lingering on a silver contraption near the headmaster's desk. Remembering the many nights he'd stood here with Dumbledore, discussing Horcruxes, Slughorn, the future. Felt like a lifetime ago. Slughorn died bravely, McGonagall added. At least, in the end, he saw reason. Harry gazed at the swirling dust motes in the air, his thoughts drifting to all that might have been different. "Yes," he murmured. "It cost us more than we can ever measure, but at least it's over now." And so it was. The cost of a single withheld memory had shaped their entire path, forced them to guess, to fight a war in the dark. Ultimately, the light had won, but victory was bittersweet, born of sacrifice that might have been avoided. As Harry left the office, he found himself vowing never to allow silence or shame to become a shield for evil. The memory that Slughorn never gave in time served as a permanent reminder that knowledge shared too late can be as destructive as ignorance itself.